Okay, this is my Chapter 16 Juvenile Corrections video presentation. To start, we have to look at probation. The textbook definition of probation is a court-ordered, non-punitive juvenile disposition that emphasizes community-based services and treatment and close supervision by an officer of the court. Probation is essentially a sentence of confinement that is suspended so long as the probationer meets the conditions imposed by the court. Examples of probation programs used by probation departments include after-school counseling, job training, runaway programs, curfew requirements, sports-based programs, truancy programs, community service, volunteer work, school-based probation, restorative programs, self-improvement classes, and the list goes on. While the effectiveness of probation is still under consideration and something that is highly debated, there are two things that were listed that can be done to improve the programs according to the textbook. The first one is implement the successful practices of adult probation, and the second one is examine the juvenile probation practices across the nation and utilize those that might be helpful in your jurisdiction. The four basic functions of probation include intake, caseload management, investigation, and reports to the court. Throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, restitution was commonly used to help the offenders repay their victims or communities for their crimes. There are three types of restitutions. The first one is straight financial restitution, the second one is community service, and the third one is direct service to the victims. Intensive supervision, which is a form of probation supervision involving frequent face-to-face contact between the probationer and the probation officer, was also something used in the 1980s in adult probation programs. Some responsibilities of probational officers who run all the programs that were kind of talked about before include determining eligibility for participation in these programs, calculating appropriate amounts, assessing the offender's ability to pay, developing a payment or work schedule, monitoring performance, and closing the cases. Next thing is community-based sanctions. The textbook definition of community-based sanctions is punishments where the juvenile offenders remain in the community. Different forms of community-based sanctions kind of vary, but they can include things like house arrest or electric monitoring. House arrest is a program of intermediate punishment whereby youths are ordered to remain confined in their own residences during evening hours, after curfew, or even on weekends. The idea for electric monitoring actually came about because a judge in New Mexico read a Spider-Man comic, and Spider-Man had a tracker on his wrist, so that's kind of where the idea originated, and he decided to implement. Other things like wilderness programs, group homes, day treatment programs are also community-based sanctions. More specifically, wilderness programs they use the wilderness, desert, sea, and urban areas in order to allow participants to gain self-resilience, to prove one's worth, and to define one's personhood. Group homes, on the other hand, are residential placements into which juveniles are assigned either while on probation or when released from a training school. Day treatment programs are non-residential programs that do not provide living and sleeping quarters, but they kind of have the same goal of rehabilitation, just kind of in different circumstances. The effectiveness of community-based sanctions is still being studied and examined, much like the effectiveness of probation. However, community-based sanctions are shown to reduce recidivism and are less expensive than confinement. Okay, next up is facilities for confinement of juveniles, both long-term and short-term. Short-term confinement of juveniles include jails, detention centers, and shelter care facilities. Jails, more specifically, some statistics about jails include between 500,000 and 1 million juveniles were put into jails throughout the 1970s. Throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, the number shrank drastically. And in 2006, it was shown that 7,083 juveniles were held in adult jails in the year of 2004. Wow, these statistics were important. They also show how putting juveniles in jail cells, especially when they end up in adult jails, is not the best form of rehabilitation. Next, detention centers. These were originally made as alternatives to jails as holding centers, since the effectiveness of jailing juveniles was still up for debate, much like it is now. However, these centers have sparked horror stories and truly scary recounts for what those held inside experienced. This spawned what is called attention homes, focusing mainly on the attention to juveniles rather than detention centers who focus on the detention of juveniles. Shelter care facilities are next. They were created in the 1970s and were meant to provide short-term care for status offenders and for dependent or negligent children. These facilities had no locked doors and are non-secure, so the stays here would only last a few days. Long-term confinement of juveniles include boot camps, reception and diagnostic centers, ranches, and wilderness camps, as well as public training schools. Boot camps prioritize shock treatment, which would shock the juveniles out of committing any more crimes. Their program was focused on military discipline, physical training, and regimented activity. This typically lasted for almost 30 to 120 days. The first boot camp was actually created in 1985 and was named the Orleans Parish Program. Next up is reception diagnostic centers. This can be privately administered or publicly administered. They are specifically designed to determine which treatment plan suits and which training school is best placed for each adjuncted juvenile. Ranches are another confinement of juveniles for longer periods of time, and they were meant for juveniles who have no priors or who have committed minor offenses. These are minimum security places, which the juveniles do conservation work, are allowed to go to town weekly to be involved in the community, and are offered rehabilitation programs such as group therapy. At the ranch, it is a more relaxed kind of security and a different type of rehabilitation than like a boot camp per se, which has more of a military focus. Training schools are also something that is used for long-term confinement. They are meant for long-term style care and have the objective of a safe, secure, and humane environment for these juveniles. This varies, though, on the requirement versus girls versus boys and security level, because it can differ when you get into maximum security, minimum security, or a medium style security. Just it kind of depends. The rights of confined juveniles is actually something that's an ongoing debate and something that is oftentimes not prioritized or not highlighted enough, and it's currently a really, really big problem within our current criminal justice system, and something that in certain cases is, like I mentioned, not prioritized and not highlighted. So the three main rights of juveniles include the right to treatment, the right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment, right to access to the courts. So those are the three main ones. First off, the right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment means that the courts have forbid or banned any juvenile institution from using corporal punishment in any form. This can be the use of Thorazine and any other medications for the purpose of control, and the use of extended periods of solitary confinement. Next up is the right to access to the courts, which means that a juvenile has a right to a hearing or a right to counsel, and this was actually found in the Supreme Court case of 1967 in Ray Galt. So that's kind of where that whole right to counsel became an idea, and how important it is that juveniles have a voice and they can have a hearing before they are either sentenced or they figure out what the punishment is for their crimes, that they can have a counsel and a hearing to kind of go over the case beforehand. Lastly, for the rights of confined juveniles, there's the right to treatment, which is the juvenile has a right to treatment once they enter the juvenile institution in which they have been assigned to. Now on to final thoughts. Our criminal justice system, specifically pertaining to juveniles, is something that should be further examined and definitely improved, from how we treat the juveniles to the type of care they're receiving, where they're being assigned, and how we ensure their positive impact on society when they are released is very, very important, and definitely something that could be improved and fixed. And after studying and going over this chapter, I think that's something that's definitely important going forward in society, and I think that's often not highlighted enough, is the gaps in our system and where we can improve and what can be better. So I think after going over this, there's definitely a different way to go forward in the future. And yeah, that wraps up the Chapter 16 Juvenile Corrections presentation for me. After reviewing and going over everything, I just wanted to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the presentation and my overview of Chapter 16, Juvenile Corrections.